There she is. That's what all the fuss is about, oil. It's kind of pretty, isn't it? Oil, coming up out of the ground to make life a bit more easy for all of us.
The United States is the world's largest consumer of fossil fuels. Oil is what drives the military machine of every country. That is, it provides the fuel for the aircraft, for the ships, for the tanks, for the trucks. Control of oil is indispensable. When you run out of it, your army stops. There is a direct connection between events that happened more than 50 years ago and the war in Iraq today. In 1953, the Prime Minister of Iran, Mohammad Mossadegh, became extremely irritated. The British were ripping off his country's national resources. He wanted a greater share in it. The British came to the new President Eisenhower and asked for help on this. Eisenhower very conveniently declared Mossadegh to be a communist, and we then set the CIA to overthrow him.
3 days of bloody rioting culminating in a military coup.
The result was we brought the Shah to power, and he created an extremely repressive regime that within 20 years had led to a revolution against him. The Ayatollah Khomeini creates a government that is violently anti-American.
For Americans shot up the hills.
Khomeini said, quote, I pray to God to cut the hands off all those foreign advisors.
In the after-action report by the CIA on what they had done in Iran in 1953, they said, we're going to get some blowback from this. We then made a puppet out of Saddam Hussein in Iraq, who was a friend of ours. He was an asset in the CIA's computers. We did so because he was anti-Iranian. He was very fearful that the revolution in Iran would spread into his country. He therefore went to war with Iran. The war was extremely bloody, went on throughout the 1980s. Unfortunately for Saddam Hussein, he began to lose the war. At that point, in comes the United States in the form of Donald Rumsfeld, sent to Saddam Hussein by President Reagan to tell him, we will supply you with intelligence, we will supply you with the weapons you may need through covert means. It is why cynics in Washington say, we know Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction, we have the receipts. This is what we mean by blowback. He remained a friend of ours right up to his invasion in the summer of 1990 of Kuwait. We became alarmed when he invaded Kuwait that he could also go on and invade Saudi Arabia itself. The largest reserves of oil on earth. We stationed troops in Saudi Arabia. It was a mistake in every sense of the term. Remember, Osama bin Laden had said, I resent the government of Saudi Arabia for using Americans to defend Saudi Arabia against Iraq. At that point, we began to fear that we were going to lose our position in Saudi Arabia. Well, the second largest source of proven reserves on earth are in Iraq. This leads us now to demonize our previous ally and to prepare the American public for the thought that we must take him out.
So let me talk a little bit about what happened in Iran and how did we get to the position we're in now. For the whole first half of the 20th century, the dominant fact of life in Iran was foreign intervention, principally by Britain and Russia, lesser extent by France and some other European powers, and bitter resentment grew up in Iran against these intervening powers. Now, during that period, the first half of the 20th century, the only Americans in Iran were missionaries and others who came to help. People that built hospitals. The American hospital in Tehran was the only place for decades where a poor person could get good medical care for free. They were educators. The statue of Samuel Jordan, the founder of Al-Borz College, which trained generations of the Iranian elite, is still a place that people in Iran go to pay pilgrimages of. They still remember the great American school teacher who was killed during the Constitutional Revolution in 1906. He was called the American Lafayette. So America was seen in Iran as the great country, the perfect country, the idealized country. They were not intervening and trying to suck our resources out like the British and the French and the Russians. America was even idealized, even beyond perhaps what we deserved at that time. So America really was in the ideal position because we were only helping, and that help was coming from private initiative. It was not a government-to-government relationship at all. Now, after World War II, the winds of nationalism were blowing through Asia and Africa, Latin America. And in Iran, nationalism meant one thing. We've got to take back control of our oil. At the beginning of the 20th century, through a corrupt deal with the declining Qajar dynasty, the British grabbed control of the entire Iranian oil industry. Even Winston Churchill, who was then First Lord of the Admiralty, said very accurately that this was a prize from fairyland beyond our wildest dreams. Mastery itself is the prize of the venture, is what he said. So all during the first half of the 20th century, the whole British economy was fueled by oil from Iran. Every factory in Britain was powered by oil from Iran. Every car and every Jeep was powered by Iranian oil. The Royal Navy, which projected British power all over the world, was fueled by oil from Iran. Britain has no oil, nor have any colonies that have oil. Everything was coming from Iran. By a period leading up to World War II, 90% of the oil being sold in Europe was coming from Iran. And all the profits were going to this one British company. So you had this situation where a poor country whose miserable people were living in some of the worst conditions of any people in the world, had an enormously valuable resource which was going to prop up the economy of a European country. So it was natural that when Iran emerged from World War II and became a real functioning democracy, that the leaders of Iran would reflect this great public clamor. We've got to take back control of our oil so we can use the profits to develop our own country. Well, naturally, the British were in a panic when they heard this. At first, they didn't believe it. One of their first orders was to ask their ambassador in Britain to approach Prime Minister Mossadegh or one of his aides and find out how much money does he really want us to put in his Swiss bank account so he can forget all this foolishness. But it turned out it wasn't just Mossadegh. It was the entire Iranian people. It wouldn't have even worked, even if you could have bribed the prime minister, because the entire people of Iran had grasped onto this cause. The British tried everything. They blockaded the port where the oil was exported from. They forced all their experts who could run the refinery to go back to Britain. And of course, they'd been very careful not to train any Iranians in how to run that refinery. They prevented agricultural and manufactured goods from getting into Iran. They took Iran to the United Nations. They took Iran to the World Court. None of this worked. So the British finally decided we have to overthrow the government of Iran. We're going to have to overthrow Prime Minister Mossadegh. They began to plan this, but Mossadegh found out what they were doing. And he did the only thing that he could have done to protect himself, which was he closed the British embassy. And he sent home all the British diplomats, including, of course, all the secret agents that were planning the coup. So now the British were really in a panic. They were losing their most valuable, richest, most lucrative property anywhere in the world. To who? Iranians? It was a huge shock. And then what happened was Prime Minister Churchill decided the only hope for us is we've got to turn to the Americans and see if we can get the Americans to do this for us. So he approached President Truman, and Truman said no. The CIA does not overthrow governments. And that was true. That was true at the time. The CIA had never overthrown a government up to that time. It was Truman's idea that it could be used for intelligence gathering, but not for that kind of operation. In fact, while I was researching this book in the Truman Library in Missouri, I found a fantastic phrase in one of Truman's letters when he was writing about the CIA. He was very worried about giving too much power to the CIA. And here's the phrase that he used to describe what he was afraid that the CIA might become. He said, American Gestapo. So Truman was very unwilling to use the CIA this way. Now the British were really in trouble. They had nothing. But then, at the end of 1952, the British Foreign Office and the Secret Service were electrified with the news that there had been an election in the United States, and a new group was coming into power. New president would be Dwight Eisenhower, and new Secretary of State would be John Foster Dulles, who had spent his entire life as the #1 international corporate lawyer for big American companies. The roster of the clients that John Foster Dulles served is essentially just a list of all the giant multinational corporations of that era. So the idea that a country somewhere out there in the world was bothering a big, giant multinational corporation or a big British or American corporation was something that Dulles took very seriously. He didn't want that example to spread. So finally, the Americans decided, we will do this. President Eisenhower and John Foster Dulles reversed the Truman policy. And they told the British, okay, we're going to do it for you. We're going to go over to Iran, and we're going to overthrow Prime Minister Mossadegh. And in the beginning of August 1953, a very intrepid CIA agent crossed over into Iran with the assignment, organize the overthrow of the government. And it's one of those wonderful quirks of history that the agent that was sent to Iran was Kermit Roosevelt, the grandson of Theodore Roosevelt, who had brought America into the regime change era back in the time of the Spanish-American War. Well, it only took Kermit Roosevelt 3 weeks to organize the overthrow of the democratic government of Iran. It didn't just mean the end of Prime Minister Mossadegh's rule. It meant the end of democracy in Iran. Now, I think many people today don't even understand that Iran ever was a democracy. But in fact, this is a country that's had a constitution for more than 100 years. And in the early 50s, it really was consolidating its democracy. If we had managed to keep our hands off Iran, we might have had a thriving democracy in the heart of the Muslim Middle East all these 50 years. And I can hardly wrap my mind around how different the world would look if we had only managed to keep our hands off.
ما در موضوع نفت با شرکت‌های عامل، یعنی کنسورسیوم نفتی که در ایران کار می‌کند، چون شاید 5-6 شرکت دیگری هست که با ما کار می‌کنند، ولی البته اونها در یک محدوده بسیار کوچکتری هست، مشغول مذاکره بودیم. مذاکرات نه قطع شده است و نه به جایی است. این است که امروز بدون ورود در جزئیات خطوط کلی آن را باید برای شما بگویم. موقعی که در 1954 ما قرارداد نفتی را امضا کردیم که شاید در اون روز بیشتر از اون هم نمیتوانستیم به دست بیاوریم، یکی از مواد قرارداد این بود که شرکت‌های عامل منافع ایران را به بهترین وجهی حفظ خواهند کرد. ما دلایلی داریم که این کار نشده است. در قرارداد 54 3 دوره تمدید 5 ساله در نظر گرفته بودند که ضمناً شرط شده بود که منافع ایران حفظ بشود. ما دلایل کافی داریم که مطابق حتی همین قرارداد 54 قرارداد نفت خود را با کنسورسیوم در سال 1979، یعنی 6 سال دیگر به هیچ وجه تمدید نکند.
Most Americans don't know is that in 1976, President Jimmy Carter orchestrated the change of power in Iran that replaced the Shah of Iran with a government led by Ayatollah Khomeini. I tell the entire shocking story about this in my new book, Jimmy Carter, The Liberal Left in World Chaos. I detail how a single decision made in the name of false hope changed the entire structure of the Muslim world and led to the establishment of the fanatical extremist movement that is responsible for terrorism around the world today. The former President of the United States supported the funding of an Islamic cleric who attempted to assassinate America's strongest Muslim ally, the Shah of Iran, and birth an Islamic revolution. Sums of $150 million were being periodically transferred to Paris into the Ayatollah Khomeini's bank account while he was in exile with the assistance of the CIA. Carter told world leaders at a summit meeting of his plan to overthrow the Shah of Iran and that Khomeini would be taking over and was a Gandhi-like figure. On April 1st of the following year, this Gandhi-like figure proclaimed the first day of the government of God in Iran. It was the birth of the Islamic Revolution. On Inauguration Day 1980 at 4:31 a.m., he secretly wire transferred $7.9 billion to buy the American hostages back after 144 days of humiliation.
He could have planned all this, masterminded all this, set up all the organization. I know that one man alone could not have done it. This I know. I know that tremendous amount of money was spent. This also I know. I know that top experts in propaganda were used to show us like tyrants and monsters, and the other side as democratic, liberal revolutionaries who wanted to save the country. I know how mean the BBC, British Broadcasting Corporation, had been towards us. This I know, because we have all the files.
Were you surprised how much freedom he had to speak out in France?
In a way, yes. In another way, we thought that wherever he would be in Europe, probably he would have had the same opportunities of speaking, and the same staff would be around him, because I don't think that he himself was planning. The planning was done somewhere else.
Where do you think the planning was done?
Well, that's the question.
علامت سواله. و اگر حقوق بشر همونطوری که گفتم برای آقای کارتر مطرح بود، چطور شد موقع که شاه رفت دیگه ایرانی حقوق نداشت که اصلا هیچ وقت حرف نزد؟ خب تمام این چیزها بود دیگه. و فقط فکر نمی کنم که پرزیدنت کارتر حالا به چه دلیلی، ولی خب همه میدونن که اون موقع انگلیس BBC شده بود بلندگوی آیت الله خمینی، تمام نطق‌های ایشونو به طرفیشون پیش از اینکه به گوش ایرانیا برسونه میرسون. چرا اینقدر امکانات تبلیغاتی بهش دادن؟
I did criticize the president because of our undercutting of what was a stalwart ally, the Shah of Iran. And I am not at all convinced that he was that far out of line with his people, or that they wanted that to happen. The Shah had done our bidding and carried our load in the Middle East for quite some time. And I did think that it was a blot on our record that we let him down. Have things gotten better? The Shah, whatever he might have done, was building low-cost housing, had taken land away from the mullahs and was distributing it to the peasants so they could be landowners, things of that kind. But we turned it over to a maniacal fanatic who has slaughtered thousands and thousands of people, calling it executions.
Because the argument is, as bad as the Shah was on human rights and other issues, he was an ally of the U.S. and probably better than the current regime, and that the U.S. should have stuck with him.
Well, we couldn't stay with him. He was not overthrown by anything the United States did. He was overthrown by his own people.
Revolution. That revolution brought to power a clique of fanatically anti-American mullahs who have spent the last 25 years bitterly and sometimes very violently working to undermine American influence all over the world. That revolution in Iran also weakened Iran enough so that Iran's biggest enemy, next door Saddam Hussein, decided to invade Iran. We were so angry at Iran that we became military allies of Saddam Hussein. President Reagan sent a high-level special envoy to meet twice with Saddam Hussein. And of course, that envoy was none other than Donald Rumsfeld. I love that photo of Rumsfeld shaking Saddam's hands. It says it all. We provided helicopters to Iraq to drop poison gas inside Iran. We provided Iraq with bombing coordinates so they could strike at targets inside Iran. So that not only shook that region, but it also brought the United States into its death embrace with Saddam. That was the beginning of the spiral down in Iraq that led us to this present debacle. The turmoil of the Islamic Revolution also led the Soviets to be terrified that there would be copycat revolutions all along their southern front. That's what led them to invade Afghanistan. And their invasion of Afghanistan is what led us to go over to Pakistan and spend hundreds of millions and even billions of dollars to train huge armies of jihadis to go off and kill the infidel. We didn't realize that those jihadis we trained were going to become the Taliban, and the infidels that they wanted to kill would be us. All of that stemmed from 3 weeks of history in 1953 in Iran. Now, to this day, I think we're still living under the emotional overhang of the hostage crisis of 1979. We just met a member of Congress today who said that I approached someone on the floor of the House and asked him if he'd support a resolution for negotiating with Iran. And he looked at me and he said, "No, they took over our embassy and seized our diplomats." We are still caught in this emotional prison. Now, I want to tell you a fascinating story that happened to me during a visit to Washington this autumn. I was on a panel discussion about Iran with several other people. One of them was one of the American hostages, one of those diplomats. Actually, it was the chief diplomat, Bruce Langan. He had been the chief of the U.S. mission in Tehran at the time the hostages were taken. I had never met him, but I knew that he'd become an advocate of reconciliation with Iran, and so I was eager to talk to him. I wanted to chat with him a little. Later, we exchanged some emails, and he told me a fascinating story, which to my knowledge has never appeared in print. He said, "I was sitting in my cell in that embassy in Iran. I had been in a solitary cell for about 1 year. And one day, unexpectedly, the door opened, and there is one of the hostage takers, one of my jailers, is standing there. And I looked up at him, and 1 year of rage and anger and fury exploded out of me, and I started screaming at him. I told him, "You have no right to do this. This is totally cruel. This violates every law of God and man. You cannot take innocent people hostage and treat them like this." He said, I went on for several minutes screaming at him, and he just waited very patiently. And when I finally ran out of breath, he leaned into my cell and pointed a finger at me and, in very good English, said, "You have no right to complain because you took our whole country hostage in 1953.
After the worst atrocities that Saddam carried out, including the gassing of the Kurds and the rest, the U.S. and Britain happily gave him aid and support, including aid that enabled him to develop weapons of mass destruction, as they knew perfectly well. And at that time, he was far more dangerous than he is today. Iraq was then a much more powerful state, and nothing was considered wrong with this. In fact, Daddy Bush went as far as in early 1990, a couple of months before the invasion of Kuwait, President Bush, number one, sent a high-level senatorial delegation headed by Bob Dole, the next presidential candidate, to Iraq to convey his greetings to his friend Saddam, tell him how much he appreciated his great contributions, and to tell him that he should disregard critical comments he's hearing occasionally from the American press. We have this free press thing here, and every once in a while somebody gets out of line, and maybe 1 out of 5,000 correspondents has a few remarks about how Saddam committed crimes, but Saddam was informed to just forget about that. He was also told that a critical commentator on Voice of America would be removed, so he wouldn't have that unpleasant experience of hearing about the bad things that he does. That was a couple of months before he became the butcher of Baghdad and conquering the world and so on and so forth. So those words are omitted, and we know that it's not his crimes that are the reason for the intended conquest, nor is it his development of weapons of mass destruction, which George Bush, number one, was aiding him in constructing at a time when he really was dangerous, as was Britain. This is just the ultimate hypocrisy, and a very good sign of the amazing discipline of educated people in the United States, Britain, France, and elsewhere, that they can let this continue without a whisper of protest. Have a look and see. Well, if those aren't the reasons, what are the reasons? Well, the reasons are pretty obvious. Iraq has the second largest oil reserves in the world after Saudi Arabia. It's been obvious all along that one way or another the U.S. would do something to regain control over that immense resource, way beyond the Caspian Sea and all of this. certainly the U.S. is going to deny those resources to its adversaries. Right now, France and Russia have the inside track on them, and the U.S. is going to take it over. And the question is how? It's a very tricky operation. One problem, there's a lot of technical problems, like, exactly how do you do it, and that's what's being discussed, but those are minor problems. The real problem is that you have to ensure that there's got to be a new regime imposed, and the new regime must be completely undemocratic, and there's a reason for that. If there's any element of democracy in the new regime, the population will have some voice in what's happening, right? That's what democracy is. Population gets maybe a minimal voice. But the problem is that the majority of the population is diplomatic correspondent for the New York Times. A diplomatic correspondent is a term which means State Department spokesman at the New York Times. He was giving the State Department line, and he was pretty frank about it. He said the best of all worlds for the United States would be an iron-fisted military junta which would rule Iraq the same way Saddam Hussein did, but with a change of name, because Saddam Hussein is kind of embarrassing at that point. And if we can't get that, we'll have to do second best. But that would be the best of all worlds, and that's the world they're trying to find now.
شرایطی که تحریم آمریکا در حقیقت زده تمام مسئله کلی تولید ایران رو، تولید نفت و مسائل دیگر رو به طور کلی در پنجه خود گرفته و این تنگنا رو ایجاد کرده. مسئله طولانی سالهای سال هست که اگر نگاه کنیم میبینیم که تولید نفت به سرمایه‌گذاری طولانی نفت احتیاج داشته. این سرمایه‌گذاری طولانی انجام نشده.
Distorted lens. What about Iran? You think we're building up, aren't we? The UN,
yeah.
The UN said, "Oh, they're making nukes," and I believe they are, and I believe that they're bad people, but I don't think that we necessarily want to embark upon World War III as a way of handling the situation. Right?
Yeah, I mean, I was. It now seems that, with Gaddafi out of the picture, Chavez dying of cancer, there's only one final step towards, in their playbook of totally conquering, the world's oil markets, and that's Iran. So if you look back at, where we were in 2000, we rolled into Afghanistan, under the auspices of 9/11, whether you believe that or not, I don't. And the fear of the Taliban and these cave dwellers.
Right.
So we invaded that nation.
Yeah.
Okay. And everybody's I'll tell you the real reason why we're there is three big reasons. Number one is opium production. Afghanistan is the largest opium production in the world. What most people don't know is the Taliban in 2001 stopped opium production throughout the whole country.
Oh, they killed the people who were doing it.
And killed the farmers.
Yeah.
And so most other people don't realize that most of the drug trade in the world is controlled by, the Anglo-American Empire. I mean, Hong Kong Shanghai Bank and, all these big prominent banks, the CIA, they've all been involved in drug running throughout, most of the world. And that narco dollar is very important to stabilize our dollar.
Yeah, go back to the opium wars and... that was all the trading houses in China and in London, and they wanted that opium flowing, and large fortunes were made.
Yeah, to balance the trade deficit that they had with China. I mean, that's another parallel that we already we're seeing. The British Empire, the empire that spanned the world, had a trade imbalance with China because China wanted silver for all their trade. So English merchants would take all their, China and silk and tea and be forced to pay in silver. Well, the Chinese didn't want any British manufactured goods to pay back. So what do you think happened to all the silver in England? Eventually flowed to China. So what did they do?
It wound up on the COMEX eventually, 10, 15 years ago, right? I mean, that's what happened to China's silver, and they've been trying to get it back ever since, and that's why we have all these games we're seeing. But yeah, you're absolutely right. So the Opium War became a way to avoid having to use silver. You could just trade opium for the finer things in life.
That's right. So that's Afghanistan, and then the other two major things are the Caspian Sea with Kazakhstan. There's a major undeveloped oil reserve there, but look where that is on the map. You got Iran to the south and east, or south and west. You got Russia to the north and to the north of it, and China to the east of it. How do we get that oil? Knowing that the dollars, the only thing that's supporting the dollar is the oil petrodollar standard. It's vital for America to be able to tap those resources against the against the other people in the area.
Right.
So through, I think, Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, and Pakistan, they were planned on doing a pipeline. Again, the Taliban said no to it. They had to go. The third major reason why we went into Afghanistan is because there's $1 trillion worth of minerals there.
Yeah.
I mean, here you got this
mineral wealth, huge.
Yeah, $1 trillion, and that's just them sampling it.
Big bucks.
So that was a major reason why we went there. So what was after that? Iraq. Well, what did Saddam do? Saddam, we were his buddy. I mean, we supported this guy. We played him. We put him in power. We, gave him breaks. We gave him an out during the first Gulf War. And he committed the major mortal sin of what?
Yeah, going off the dollar, right?
That's right. He sold oil for euros during the UN weapons for food scandal, and did tremendously well. Yeah, the price of oil dropped significantly in dollar terms. In euro terms, all the money that Saddam was making was saved in euros, and the euro was very strong there. And he had to go.
Yep. And well, we were talking before. Like they said, Gaddafi amassed a fortune of $200 billion. Mubarak, Egypt, the people have nothing. They're dirt poor, right? They're just totally destitute. Mubarak had a nice little $60 billion nest egg. And, you can only imagine the fortunes that these despotic rulers have amassed and are invested all over the place, totally opaque, can't figure out where. And the collapse of the dollar is going to smoke all of them out and force them to really.
Well, and that, I mean, bringing it now to Libya, 10 years ago, I mean, to do what we did in Libya would have been front page news. It would have been congressional debates and protests and wars. Think about how desensitized we've become to, these wars without any purpose. These what's the word I'm looking for? Preemptive wars. Now it's like as a matter of
adventurism.
Yeah. So here we went and start bombing the crap out of them, funding the rebels, bringing them in, get Gaddafi out. And again, what was his mortal sin? The guy's been there for 41 years. Why now?
And he wasn't. There were things. He was a nut job. I mean, and certainly was portrayed as such in the media. But he was eccentric, shall we put it that way? Not that a lot of other rulers aren't. But he wasn't. He didn't strike me as being a mass murdering type maniac.
No.
Whenever anybody got married in Libya, he gave the
$40,000,
$30,000. He gave them. That's not the sign of a guy who's killing his people.
I tell you what, now that I've unfortunately, I grew up under the Republican, Gaddafi's a scumbag, in 1987 we should have kept bombing him type thing. But now these videos come out, I'm assuming they're true, that gasoline is only like, 18 cents a gallon. There's free farmland, free seed. To anybody who wants to work the land, young couples get married, they get $40,000. There's no debt, no interest on any loans that are given out. You want to start a business, all that's there. And that he had the largest mass of gold in Africa.
You just raised an incredible point. Okay, so you just raised a great point, and that is that under Islam, you're not allowed to charge interest. So they've come up with all sorts of ways of avoiding the prohibition, but maybe there's something to it, that one of the animosities towards that religion is that bankers can't get an even break.
That's right.
Right?
I mean, think about it. I mean, you know, you have this Islamic revolution, Islamic Spring, Brotherhood, Muslim thing, whatever they got going on over there. What has been, you know, the Muslims' great sin? Their great sin is that they're sitting on our oil and that they don't use interest.
Yeah.
Well, that's the basis for our society. Our basis is spreading debt and death. Yeah. We cannot do that without oil, and we cannot do that without debt. Yeah, and that's why I'm saying that the final tipping point here is Iran, because now we have this final point where here's another country that is currently selling since 2008 oil for any other currency in the world. In 2008, they opened up the Iranian oil bourse on the Isle of Kish.
Right.
And if you remember, towards the end of Bush's second,
we cut 2 transatlantic cables to shut them down.
Yeah.
Right. Remember that?
Oh yeah. And if you remember at the end of Bush's second term, there was all this push to fight for a war there. And Seymour Hersh was in on a meeting with Cheney, and they were trying to come up with ways of causing a casus bellis, a cause for the Iranians to start a war there. And the best they could come up with was this Iranian speedboat incident that they thought that was going to do it, and it totally got blown out of the water. But man, you know, back then it was all ready.
There was a meeting in the White House where Cheney presided over, looking to cook up the next war, a false war based on false intelligence.
My oldest son is a lawyer, and when I sent him the story before it was published, basically in a final form, just a day, and he wrote back and he said, "You really buried the lead in this one." But casus belli. How many press are here? Anyway, there was a meeting among the items considered and rejected, which is why the New Yorker did not publish it on grounds that it wasn't accepted. One of the items was, why not, there was a dozen ideas proffered, how to trigger a war. The one that interested me the most was, why don't we in our shipyard build 4 or 5 boats that look like Iranian PT boats, put Navy SEALs on them with a lot of arms, and the next time one of our boats goes through the Straits of Hormuz, start a shoot-up. Might cost some lives, and it was rejected because you can't have Americans killing Americans. But that's the level of stuff we were talking about, provocation. But that was rejected. So I could understand the argument of not writing something that was rejected. Maybe. I basically, my attitude always towards editors is they're mice training to be rats. So, but you have to, you know, but the point is, J. June, if you know what that means, silly, maybe, but potentially very lethal, because one of the things they learned in the incident was the American public, if you get the right incident, the American public will support, you know, bang, bang, kiss, kiss, you know, we're into it. And the public, although that was the other side that had issue that was important, what happened in the Gulf, in the Straits in early January, the president was just about to go to the Middle East for a visit. So it was that was one reason they wanted to gin it up, get it going. Look, is it high school? Yeah. Are we playing high school with, you know, 5,000 nuclear warheads in our arsenal? Yeah, we are. We're playing, you know, who's the first guy to run off the highway with us in Iraq.
And things haven't changed any, you know.
No, and now you got all this talk about Israel doing, you know, making the final leap to attack Iran. And again, it's all about nuclear weapons. No, folks, it's about oil. It's about the dollar. It's about Anglo-American empire. It's about us conquering the world. And this is the last point. And I don't think Iran is actually the toughest of all those little nations. You know, it's a properly educated, you know, wealthy society. It's not, it hasn't been
too content with their government either, though.
Yeah, I know, but listen, I'm not happy with Obama, but I tell you what, if China lands on my shores, you know.
Yeah, well, that's an interesting thing. I was reading about somebody whose theory is that after the empire collapses, after the dollar collapses, there's going to be score settling with us because we've been bullying the whole world for, since World War I, arguably. Maybe since the Russo-Japanese, since the early 1900s, we've kind of been bullying the world. So Russia, this guy was theorizing Russia and China are going to like come after us, invade us. Now, personally, I think that's highly unlikely.
Yeah, I posed something similar to that, but it wasn't about them coming after us. The idea that I put out there was called the anti-hegemon. And the idea is that we're a hegemon. We're a world hegemon. We control the world. But there's a group of actors out there who don't necessarily benefit off this paradigm. So it's very easy to see that Iran, China, Russia, Venezuela, don't benefit from the Anglo-American Empire, and they've all become victims of that Anglo-American Empire. We were talking earlier about the Opium Wars. Yeah. We could talk about the Mossadegh in Iran getting overthrown by CIA operatives. The collapse of Russia. World War II, World War I, and all these nations don't benefit off of the Anglo-American Empire. And while I don't think that they're going to aggressively attack us, because they don't need to, you have to understand all the posturing and fighting and all this other stuff has been all around the great chessboard, which is Asia. We're the ones that have been interfering in there. I think what's going to happen is if the dollar collapses, we won't have the ability, funds, popularity, moral fortitude to do anything. And it's just going to be a retreat. It'll be a vacuum. Those nations are going to be able to spread their regional wings, but I don't think they're going to, take that as a ticket to come invade us.
Since the inception of the Federal Reserve in 1913, a number of large and small wars have commenced. The three most pronounced were World War I, World War II, and Vietnam. World War I. In 1914, European wars broke out centered around England and Germany. The American public wanted nothing to do with the war. In turn, President Woodrow Wilson publicly declared neutrality. However, under the surface, the U.S. administration was looking for any excuse it could find to enter it. In a noted observation by Secretary of State William Jennings, the large banking interests were deeply interested in the World War because of the wide opportunities for large profits. It's important to understand that the most lucrative thing that can happen for the international bankers is war, for it forces the country to borrow even more money from the Federal Reserve Bank at interest. Woodrow Wilson's top advisor and mentor was Colonel Edward House, a man with intimate connections with the international bankers who wanted in the war. In a documented conversation between Colonel House, Wilson's advisor, and Sir Edward Grey, the Foreign Secretary of England, regarding how to get America into the war, Grey inquired, "What will Americans do if Germans sink an ocean liner with American passengers on board?" House responded, "I believe that a flame of indignation would sweep the United States, and that by itself would be sufficient to carry us into war." So, on May 7, 1915, on essentially the suggestion of Sir Edward Grey, a ship called the Lusitania was deliberately sent into German-controlled waters, where German military vessels were known to be. And, as expected, German U-boats torpedoed the ship, exploding stored ammunition, killing 1,200 people. To further understand the deliberate nature of this setup, the German embassy actually put advertisements in the New York Times telling people that if they boarded the Lusitania, they did so at their own risk, as such a ship sailing from America to England through the war zone would be liable to destruction. In turn, and as anticipated, the sinking of the Lusitania caused a wave of anger among the American population, and America entered the war a short time after. The First World War caused 323,000 American deaths. J.D. Rockefeller made $200 million off of it. Not to mention the war cost about $30 billion for America, most of which was borrowed from the Federal Reserve Bank at interest, furthering the profits of the international bankers. World War II. On December 7, 1941, Japan attacked the American fleet at Pearl Harbor, triggering our entry into that war. President Franklin D. Roosevelt declared the attack was a day that will live in infamy. A day of infamy indeed, but not because of the alleged surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. After 60 years of surfacing information, it is clear that not only was the attack on Pearl Harbor known weeks in advance, it was outright wanted and provoked. Roosevelt, whose family had been New York bankers since the 18th century, whose uncle Frederick was on the original Federal Reserve Board, was very sympathetic to the interests of the international bankers, and the interest was to enter the war, as we've seen, nothing is more profitable for international bankers than war. In a journal entry by Roosevelt's Secretary of War Henry Stimson, dated November 25, 1941, he documented a conversation he had with Roosevelt. The question was, how should we maneuver them into firing the first shot? It was desirable to make sure the Japanese be the ones to do this, so that there should remain no doubt as to who were the aggressors. In the months leading up to the attack on Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt had done almost everything in his power to anger the Japanese, showing a posture of aggression. He halted all of Japan's imports of American petroleum. He froze all the Japanese assets in the United States. He made public loans to nationalist China and supplied military aid to the British, both enemies of Japan in the war, which, by the way, is completely in violation of international war rules. And on December 4th, 3 days before the attack, Australian intelligence told Roosevelt about a Japanese task force moving towards Pearl Harbor. Roosevelt ignored it. So, as hoped and allowed, on December 7th, 1941, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, killing 2,400 soldiers. Before Pearl Harbor, 83% of the American public wanted nothing to do with the war. After Pearl Harbor, 1 million men volunteered for the war. It is important to note, Nazi Germany's war effort was largely supported by two organizations, one of which was called IG Farben. IG Farben produced 84% of Germany's explosives, and even the Zyklon B used in the concentration camps to kill millions. One of the unspoken partners of IG Farben was J.D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil Company in America. In fact, the German Air Force could not operate without a special additive patented by Rockefeller's Standard Oil. The drastic bombing of London by Nazi Germany, for example, was made possible by a $20 million sale of fuel to IG Farben by the Rockefeller Standard Oil Company. This is just one small point on the topic of how American business funded both sides of World War II. One other treasonous organization worth mentioning is the Union Banking Corporation of New York City. Not only did it finance numerous aspects of Hitler's rise to power, along with actual materials during the war, it was also a Nazi money laundering bank, which was eventually exposed for having millions of dollars of Nazi money in its vaults. The Union Banking Corporation of New York was eventually seized for violations of the Trading with the Enemy Act. Guess who the director and vice president of the Union Bank was? Prescott Bush, our current president's grandfather, and of course our former president's father. Keep that in mind when considering the moral and political dispositions of the Bush family. Vietnam. The United States' official declaration of war on North Vietnam in 1964 came after an alleged incident involving two U.S. destroyers being attacked by North Vietnamese PT boats in the Gulf of Tonkin. This was known as the Gulf of Tonkin Incident. This single situation was the catalytic pretext for massive troop deployment and full-fledged warfare. One problem, however, the attack on the U.S. destroyers by Vietnamese PT boats never happened. It was a completely staged event to have an excuse to enter the war. Former Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara stated years later that the Gulf of Tonkin incident was a mistake, while many other insiders and officers have come forward, relaying that it was a contrived farce, a complete lie. Once in the war, it was business as usual. In October 1966, President Lyndon Johnson lifted trading restrictions on the Soviet bloc, knowing full well that the Soviets were providing upwards of 80% of North Vietnam's war supplies. Consequently, Rockefeller interests financed factories in the Soviet Union, which the Soviets used to manufacture military equipment and send it to North Vietnam. However, the funding of both sides of this conflict was only one side of the coin. In 1985, Vietnam's rules of engagement were declassified. This detailed what American troops were and were not allowed to do in the war. It included absurdities like North Vietnamese anti-aircraft missile systems could not be bombed until they were known to be fully operational. No enemy could be pursued once they crossed the border of Laos or Cambodia. And most revealing of all, the most critical strategic targets were not allowed to be attacked unless initiated by high military officials. Apart from these imposed ludicrous limitations, North Vietnam was informed of these restrictions and therefore could base entire strategies around the limitations of the American forces. This is why the war went on so long. And the bottom line is this: the Vietnam War was never meant to be won, just sustained. This war for profit resulted in 58,000 American deaths and 3 million dead Vietnamese. So, where are we now? September 11th was the jumpstart for what is now an accelerated agenda by the ruthless elite. It was a staged war pretext no different than the sinking of the Lusitania, the provoking of Pearl Harbor, and the Gulf of Tonkin lie. In fact, if 9/11 wasn't a planned war pretext, it would be an exception to the rule. It has been used to launch 2 unprovoked illegal wars, one against Iraq and one against Afghanistan. However, 9/11 was a pretext for another war as well, the war against you.
A couple of weeks ago, the IAEA comes out, that's the International Atomic Energy Association, and says that they are significantly concerned that Iran is now reconstituting a nuclear weapons program. Now, they didn't quite say that, but they said a lot of things that made people think that, and then you got the headlines in the New York Times, etc. And the IAEA, so you know, has a lot of credibility. It was run by Mohammed al-Baradei, and they did a great job of checking the nuclear program that Iran had in the 1980s through the 1990s. That gained them credibility. But they also had credibility because they questioned the Bush administration when they had bad information on Iraq and on Iran. So when the IAEA came out with that report, I came out here on the Young Turks and said, whoa, that's something to be concerned about. These are not just some neocons, pretending to have intelligence when we know that's not the case. So I wonder if Iran is in fact doing that. Well, Seymour Hersh now has a terrific report that shows that's not necessarily the case, and why we might not be able to trust the IAEA as much anymore. So first, let me tell you why it's not a very good case. Classic example here, New York Times in the front section runs the story about, oh my God, Iran might be going back into nuclear weapons. But then they ran a second story where they had this quote that Hersh points out. They say, quote, "It is true that the basic allegations in the report are not substantially new and have been discussed by experts for years." In other words, they actually have nothing new at all. Let's continue. They say that the source is actually a single source. It's from Western intelligence, and the IAEA is relying then on Western intelligence, who will not tell us where that source is coming from at all. The provenance of that source has not been established. So this evidence now is getting weaker and weaker. And that, in fact, Robert Kelly, who's the retired IAEA director, says this is, quote, old news. So there's nothing new here. And remember, when they refer to old news, in 2007, even our intelligence came out and said Iran is not working on a weapons program, okay? So it's one thing to work on an nuclear energy program, it's another thing to work on a nuclear weapons program. So when they cite it as old news, it's something we knew already when we had our assessment that they are not working on a weapons program. It gets worse. Arms Control Association is a nonprofit group whose whole mission is to make sure that we have non-proliferation. They do not want nuclear weapons. They say there is trouble evidence suggesting that the studies are still going on, but there is nothing that indicates that Iran is really building a bomb. Nothing, okay? And then senior IAEA official, another one, coming out saying, I was, quote, underwhelmed by the information. So as you look at this, it does not look like there's altogether that much to be concerned about, despite all the media and the press that you saw about, oh my God, the Iranians are coming with a nuclear weapons program. And by the way, one last piece here. The report did note that on-site camera inspection process of their facilities, and remember, this agency has cameras at Iran's nuclear facilities, quote, continues to verify the non-diversion of declared nuclear material. In other words, they are not diverting it from the energy program into a weapons program. Not diverting it. So it's the exact opposite of what our press reported. So the question is why? Well, Seymour Hersh has an answer to that as well. Remember that Mohammed al-Baradei is no longer with the IAEA. There's a new regime. It's a gentleman by the name of Yukiya Amano of Japan who's now leading it. And through WikiLeaks, we find out what Amano's been up to and what our views of it are, the U.S. intelligence officials and the U.S. administration.
Well, there was a U.S. embassy cable from Vienna that said that Amano was, quote, ready for prime time. The reason they say that is that's their way of saying, don't worry, he's on our side. He'll give us what we want. Well, they got a lot more specific. In September of 2009, Glenn Davies, who's America's permanent representative to the IAEA, said this about Amano, quote, Amano reminded Ambassador on several occasions that he would need to make concessions to the G77, that's the group of developing countries, which correctly required him to be fair-minded and independent, but that he was solidly in the U.S. court on every strategic decision, from high-level personnel appointments to the handling of Iran's alleged nuclear weapons program. So there it is. There's, again, because of WikiLeaks we find this out, otherwise we wouldn't have known it at all. Our guy's saying, don't worry, this new guy at the IAEA is totally on our side. In order to be fair, he'll pretend to be with the third world countries, pretend to be fair in essence, and then he will support us, including on the Iran inspections, whatever message we want to push out. And then finally, they said the fact that he is the new leadership there, quote, bodes well for our future relationship. So, should you be concerned about Iran's nuclear weapons program? Apparently not. Apparently it's the neocons still in our administration, still in our intelligence network, drumming this up, putting it out to the press, just like they did with Iraq, and getting the right people and the right organizations to play ball. Actually, that's scarier than anything else, because that means we might be heading toward another war, not because of Iran, but because of our neoconservatives.
Hirsch says that not everyone in the administration thinks an attack on Iran is a good thing, including Secretary of Defense Robert Gates.
Well, Gates late last year went to a closed-door meeting of the Democratic caucus. This is an off-the-record meeting. And so with that kind of confidence, Gates spoke rather openly. If we bomb Iran, he said, our grandchildren will be fighting jihadists. In other words, we'll be dealing with al-Qaeda or that ilk for the next couple of decades, generations. And it was very troubling to the members. They asked a lot of questions about it, and he assured them he was speaking only for himself, obviously.
Others have also suggested that force might not be the best way.
The historical pattern in Iran has been that when attacked, people rally around the flag. We saw that in 1980 when Saddam Hussein invaded Iran. This was at a time when Iran was in great chaos. The revolutionary regime had executed a large number of people from the Iranian military. Khomeini's grip on power was not as strong. He was in a very intense power struggle. But then Saddam invaded, thinking that Iran was weak, thinking that the Iranians would not unify. And within weeks, you had 100,000 volunteers rushing to Khuzestan region in order to expel the invaders. And a lot of historians argue that the Khomeini government did not survive in spite of Saddam's attack. He survived because of Saddam's attack. And if history were to repeat itself, which it so often does, then an attack on Iran would not weaken the government in Iran, it would strengthen it. An attack on Iran would not help the pro-democracy forces in Iran, it would kill it. An attack on Iran would not prevent an Iranian nuclear bomb, it would probably cause it to rush towards a nuclear bomb.
So now we really need this sense of global responsibility. That's, I think, very important. Firstly, the economy itself, now global economy, heavily interdependent. Then environment issue. An environment issue is the issue of entire 6 billion human beings issue, not one this nation or that nation's issue. And to tackle these, we have to look, because a holistic way, you see, taking care of your own economy and don't care other. It's a reality eventually you will suffer. So according to the new reality, the very concept of we and they is no longer there. We must, because of that, we must look entire human being, entire world as part of yourself. You have to take care. So therefore, the global sense of global responsibility on the basis of recognition, clear sort of awareness, oneness of humanity. That's important. Therefore, the concept of war, I always sharing with people, concept of war is outdated. Why? War, that concept happen or start, and to some extent, some cases it worked, where the interest of one group and interest of other group separate, independent. Then the destruction of that group is victory of this group. So therefore, now today, this group's interest entirely depend on that group's interest also depend on this group. So under that reality, according to that reality, destruction of your neighbor is destruction of yourself. So, you see, they using force, destroy so-called your enemy is outdated. So enemy, different views, different interests, therefore we call enemy, but still part of yourself. Therefore, out of respect, out of sort of genuine concern of their well-being, then we have to find ways and means to reduce conflict. So that's dialogue. So I often, you see, sharing with people, the 20th century become like century of bloodshed. Millions, how many millions of human beings killed during 20th century? Hundreds, I think almost 100, like that, and including civil war. So these are very, very unfortunate. So therefore, now out of our past experience, now we have to look, this century should be century of dialogue. Whenever we face some disagreement, some different interest or conflict, we have to find ways and means to solve that through dialogue, through talk. Keep in your mind their interest and respect their future. So that's the only way. So let us try to build certain sort of concept in our mind. Now this century should be century of dialogue.